All right. So in this video, I want to keep discussing chapter 1 of the Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, and I want to bring us right up to the point where we can present the first version of the categorical imperative. That'll happen in another video. So where we left off with the text was right about here. Now, this is one of the really good things. So I'm going to point out a really good thing about this translation I'm having you use, and also a really bad thing. The really good thing is right here as we restart. So he says, so much for the first proposition of morality. For an action having genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. All right, you might think, well, what's so good about that? Well, here's what's good about that. Here's the actual text, or the better translation, right? So you have the section about, it is undoubtedly in this way, again, that we are to understand the passages from Scripture. So all the stuff about love. And then goes right into the second proposition, is this. But nowhere prior to this, in the actual text, does Kant tell us what the first proposition is. What this translation has done is just added this little section. That said, so that's helpful. It's like an incredibly annoying thing about what Kant actually wrote, that he starts talking about three propositions only with the second proposition and never actually tells you what the first one is. Because he never tells you what the first proposition is, this is actually something of an inference or an interpretation, right? You could decide that something else was the first proposition. You could think, for example, that the first proposition is the very first claim of chapter 1. Nothing in the world or out of it can possibly conceive that would be called good without qualification except a good will. That's possible. Right? The translator here has followed the majority opinion of Kant interpreters of saying the first proposition is, for an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. I think this makes sense. And so I'll just move along. I'll just point out this is a really nice thing. It really clarifies, with the possibility that there's a mistake in the way they've clarified it, but they probably aren't mistaken. This is probably right. Everything up to this point, the idea is, has been there to prove the first proposition. Or not prove, because Kant doesn't actually think he proves anything in this chapter. He thinks he's deriving these claims from common sense morality. He thinks at this point he's given lots of cases to show that common sense morality is committed to the first proposition. For an action to have genuine moral worth, it must be done from duty. The second proposition says, an action that is done from duty doesn't get its moral value from the purpose that's to be achieved through it, but from the maxim that it involves, giving the reason why the person acts thus. Then, this translation says, so the action's moral value doesn't depend on whether what is aimed at in it is actually achieved. That is just a restatement of something that was said earlier. But here I'm going to go to the more faithful translation, the translation that's frankly more difficult to read, where he says, the second proposition is this: an action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided on, and therefore does not depend upon the realization of the object of the action, but merely upon the principle of volition, blah, 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 blah. Kant's sentences are terrible. He's got one sentence in this book that goes on, I'm not making this up, for a page. Like, it's a whole page long. I want to point out the difference here. And it's a pretty substantial difference. And this is the bad thing about the translation I'm giving you. It's free. It's more readable in some ways, but they have made some changes. What's missing, basically, is the word therefore, right? And to explain the difference, let me go to the whiteboard here. There are two things that Kant is denying, and the translation you have only makes clear one of those things. So let's actually, before we get to that, let's write what the three propositions are. The three propositions. All right, proposition 1, only actions done from duty have moral worth. This I've already went over in the video on goodwill and duty, and also to some extent in the video on the goodwill. And proposition 2, Actions don't get their moral worth from the purpose to be achieved, but only from their maxim. I'm going to spend a little time explaining this. I'm going to explain to you what a maxim is. I'm also going to explain to you an issue that arises because of the first part of this proposition. This proposition is like sort of a compound proposition. It's actually saying two things. Actions don't get their moral worth from the purpose to be achieved. Actions do get their moral worth from their maxim. So let's talk about the first one, because this is what I was going on about in the a little bit before, when I was saying that the translation I've given you has a little bit of a problem here. So let's think about purposes to be achieved. Right? He's already said, Kant, that a goodwill isn't good because of what it attains, right? Of what it actually produces or achieves. And you could interpret him in Proposition 2 as just really saying that over again, right? And adding to it this thing about the maxim. That's pretty clear, or pretty clearly, what the translators of the version I've given you think, because the way they've stated it, this is just again the claim that a goodwill isn't good because of what it achieves. But that's not quite what it says, right? So go back to the better translation, the one that costs money. I mean, I have a copy of it that wouldn't cost any money if I just sent it to you, but that would be violating intellectual property, which would be a very non-Kantian thing to do. So it would be extra bad to do that while teaching Kant. The better translation says, the second proposition is this: an action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose to be attained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action. So there's two things here. There's the purpose to be attained, and there's the realization of that purpose. So we can distinguish, and here I'll move it over here, purpose or goal, and then achievement of that goal. That "and therefore" makes clear that what is going on here is that Kant is saying morally good actions, morally worthy actions, don't get their value from this. And because they don't get their value from this, they also don't get it from this. Right? To explain the difference here, let's suppose I am trying to help poor people, right? Let's say I see a homeless problem in the city I live in, and I decide that I'm going to do something about it. So that's my purpose or my goal. Right? I can have that purpose or goal without achieving the goal. Right? So you could imagine a situation where I try to help the homeless people in the city, but I fail. I would still have that purpose or goal, I just wouldn't have achieved it. Right? So that's how you know they're different things. One can exist without the other. I can have the goal without achieving the goal. Kant has already made clear he thinks it doesn't matter whether or not you achieve some particular thing. Right? He made that clear earlier in the book. But what he's doing here is saying the explanation for why the achievement of your goal isn't necessary for moral worth is that the goal was never the reason why what you were doing was worthy in the first place. Right? So the reason why failure to achieve a goal doesn't matter is that the goal actually didn't matter, or at least the goal didn't make your action right in the first place. Just having a good goal doesn't make your action good. Right? So it's not that my action is good because I was trying to do something helpful, whether or not I actually succeeded. That's a pretty straightforward point. Almost everybody would accept that. Nothing really controversial there, right? The next author we're going to look at, John Stuart Mill, the last author we're going to look at, says much the same thing, right? If you're trying to evaluate people's motivations, you evaluate the thing they're trying to do, not what they actually did, because motivations can be different than what you actually do. Right? Kant is explaining why what you actually do doesn't determine moral worth by pointing out that even your goal doesn't determine moral worth. And this is going to play a big role later. What it means is there's a perfectly coherent, at least on its face, position about what makes motivations good or bad that Kant is ruling out. You could think a motivation is a good motivation if it aims at an effect that's good. If you're trying to produce a good result. Whether or not you actually produce it is a different thing, but if you're just evaluating the motivation, you might think, well, here's how you evaluate a motivation. You just look at what the motivation is for, you evaluate that thing on its own, and that makes the motivation good or bad. Kant is denying that in the second proposition. And unfortunately, the translation you have doesn't make that clear. It omits rather, the therefore from the better translation. All he says is, that your translator here, so the action's moral value doesn't depend on whether what his aim is actually achieved. He's already said that. That's nothing new. He's going beyond that in the second proposition. And it's worth pointing that out because this might be something you disagree with, even if you agree with the earlier claim. Like I said, almost everybody agrees that achievement of some goal is not going to determine whether your action was morally right or not. People can do the right thing by accident, right? They can produce the good result without meaning to, right? You could be trying to assassinate some public figure, right? And so you go up on top of some building and you pull out your rifle and you aim it at the public official, right? And you're there, and the Secret Service sees you, right? They see you up there, so they pull the public official, the president or the senator or the governor, off stage to prevent you from shooting them. And then after they get them off stage, a few minutes later, a bomb goes off, right? Set by a totally different assassin who was going to blow them up. So you're trying to kill that person, actually save their life, right? Clearly not your goal. You went up there with a rifle. That's not an excuse for your behavior. You can't go before the judge and say, well, actually, I saved that person's life. So, right? No, that's not going to fly. They're going to be like, well, but you were trying to kill him, right? Everybody agrees to that claim. Kant is saying something stronger. Kant is saying that even what you were trying to do doesn't make your action a morally worthy action, or even a morally bad action. All right, so I wanted to explain that. The next thing to explain is what a maxim is. A maxim is a principle that explains your behavior. Kant's idea is that for something to count as an action, as opposed to just mere behavior, right? And I'll explain that contrast in just a minute. In order for it to count as an action, it has to follow from some principle that the agent accepts, right? So as an example of mere behavior, imagine a kind of twitch, right? Now, suppose that whenever someone around me is wearing too much cologne, right? Somebody really laid on the Axe body spray too much, something that lots of people in college do. Suppose whenever anyone does that, like I enter a room and there's somebody who's really laid it on thick, right? I do that, right? Got a little twitch. And I don't mean to do it. Right? I'm not trying to do it, but it's something my body does in that situation. That's not an action. It's behavior. I mean, like if you were observing me and you were told to record my behavior, that's definitely one of the things you would record. You'd be like, dude twitches when stuff smells wrong. Right? But it's not an action in the following sense. Like it wouldn't make sense to ask me why I'm doing that, right? Now, I might have an explanation. I'll say, well, I do that whenever I'm around too much cologne, right? Or body spray or whatever. But that's the same kind of explanation you would give for something like, you know, why did the tree fall down? Well, it fell down because of the wind. But the tree wasn't acting. Right? It's not like the tree was like, oh, it's windy, better go down now. Right? The tree didn't have a reason to do it. The tree just did it. There were circumstances that made the tree do it. You can explain the trees falling down by appeal to the circumstances. In the same way that you can explain my tick, right? Like that, by appeal to the circumstances. Too much Axe body spray. But if it's an action, then it has to be the case, Kant thinks, that the agent is doing it for a reason. And that reason is expressed by the maxim. It's the principle that the agent accepts, which implies that the agent ought to have done that thing. Right? And maxims have a form. To put it in the subjective sense, and here I'll change colors a little bit so that we know what we're talking about here. So we have maxim. Maxim takes the form of I will do X in C to achieve O, where X is a kind of action or an action type. And what I mean by action type is just, there can be more than one of it, right? So this is me lifting a cup. Lifting a cup is an action type. There's lots of different occasions where people lift cups. More than one thing can count as a cup lifting. Why this will be important will become clear in the next video where we deal with the first version of the categorical imperative. But for now, just know that the X there stands for an action type. C is the circumstances. The circumstances in which you're behaving. As will also become clear in the next video, it's not all the circumstances or the circumstances in total that'll generate a problem, but it's a characterization of the circumstances, of the relevant features of the circumstances, the aspects of the situation you're in that are relevant to you doing X, right? And because like some facts about the situation you're in have nothing to do with why you're doing what you're doing. So for example, the action I'm taking right now is recording a video. Some of the things that are true of my circumstances right now are relevant to that. That I'm employed by a university that's now teaching online is relevant to that. That I'm going to be teaching online in the future is relevant to that. That I have kids who need to be fed, right, is relevant to that, because that's going to be relevant to like why I keep the job and stuff like that. There's all sorts of facts that are relevant to why I'm doing the action in my current circumstances. What's not relevant about why I'm doing what I'm doing is the fact that this book, The Longman Anthology of World Literature, Volume C, The Early Modern Period, was the first book I touched when I put my hand to the left, right? That's a fact about the circumstances I'm in, but it is not a relevant fact about the circumstances I'm in. So not every fact gets into C, just the relevant ones. And then O is the object or goal of your action or purpose, right? O is the thing that in proposition number 2, Kant is saying that's not what makes the action morally worthy. Now, I will point out there are some people who want to include an extra element to the maxim for reasons R. The idea is there's some reason you want to perform the action. Right? Now, I don't think much hinges on whether or not you include R in the maxim. It's going to be the case that when you're trying to figure out why someone was doing what they're doing, which is what Kant is going to say is important in figuring out their moral worth, that you're going to need to say something about the reasons for pursuing the object or goal, right? But whether or not that gets included in the maxim, one way or another, it's going to be relevant. So might as well put it in there, right? So R is reasons. Right? And the idea is R is the reasons for O in particular. That was a weird drawing. Okay, so that's what all maxims are. They all have that form. What Kant is saying is it's the maxim that makes or determines whether or not the action is morally worthy. All right, finally, the last proposition. To have a duty is to be required to do X from respect for the law. Explaining this fully is something that's going to take a while, and a lot of it's going to be in the next video. But I do want to point out an important thing about what Kant says. So for one thing, he says that 3 is supposed to follow from 1 and 2. I don't see how it can. I don't think it does. However, here's what I think is true. A full explanation of why Kant says in what he says in Proposition 2 is going to go a long way in justifying what he says in 3. Because you need an explanation for why Kant is ruling out the idea that having a particular purpose or goal in action is enough to make your action have moral worth or not. He says that's not what decides it, right? Why not? Well, Kant says the only thing that can incline you towards some purpose or goal, towards the making of some change in the world, is preference or desire. Basically, two words for the same thing. He says you can't, that's the only thing that can make you want some end more than any other, right? Want some goal more than any other. It's just your desires. Whenever you have some interest in making the world be a certain way, Kant thinks that's really just your desire. Right? And that can't ever be enough to make your action morally worthwhile. Your desires can't make your actions morally worthwhile. And we already saw a little bit of why in the stuff from the previous video. You don't have control over your desires. Your desires aren't, Kant thinks, a result of your will. Right? Now, keep in mind, Plato and Aristotle especially, is going to say, well, no. Some desires are just rational desires and some aren't. Right? So if your will is just your rational part of your soul when it makes decisions, then yeah, your will can imply certain desires. Kant rejects that. Kant thinks you've got the rational part of you and the desiring part of you. And the rational part of you cannot generate a desire. It cannot even really alter your desires. Your desires, you just have. Right? You have them because of maybe your genetics. Kant wouldn't have known about genes, but your inheritance, right? You can have it because of your upbringing. You can have it because of the social pressures on you. There's all sorts of things that lead you to have the desires you have, but you don't have control of them. And if you don't have control over them, then they can't be the basis for morality, because in order for you to have an obligation to do something, you have to be able to do it. So you can't have any obligation to have one desire or another. But he thinks only desire can lead you to prefer some object, goal, or purpose. Only desire can make you prefer that. Right? And that's why it can't be the basis for moral judgment. Right? When we evaluate your actions, we can't evaluate you on the basis of the goal you have, because the goal you have is determined by your desire. So, what's left, he thinks, is respect for the law. Not a respect for a preference. He thinks you can't have respect for your own desires. He thinks you can't have respect for what your desires are for. You can't have respect for goals. And that is a fairly controversial claim, but that's what he says. What he thinks you can have respect for is the moral law. But what's the moral law? Well, it's the categorical imperative, and I'm going to explain that in the next video.